Welcome, and I'd like to ask you to just begin by stating your name and telling us how you met Gunther.
My name is Samuel Adler, and for many years I was in Dallas, Texas. And I think it was 1963 when the Dallas Symphony asked Gunther Schuller to come to Dallas to conduct his symphony. He only wrote one piece called Symphony, and they wanted to do it. And at that time, I was chair of the what they called the Texas Composers League, and made up of all many composers in Texas. And since Gunther was coming, we did two things. Number one, we gave a dinner in his honor, and number two, we gave a performance of some of his works and some works by Texas composers, including my first piano trio. And I conducted his double quintet, which is woodwind quintet and brass quintet. It's a wonderful piece and a very difficult piece, but they played it beautifully. And I remember giving a talk at the banquet we had for him called "The Composer in the Provinces." You know, saying, "Oh, we poor people here in Texas, and you guys in Boston and in New York, you look down upon us as kind of peasants." And it was very funny, and Gunther just loved it. And then when we came home from the concert, I took him back to his hotel, and he said to me, "Sam, you know, I like you so much personally. I wish I could like your music. I think it's awful." Well, I felt a little taken aback by that. Later on, I didn't feel so much taken aback because that was Gunther, you know, he expressed his deep thoughts that way. If he liked something, he said so. If he didn't like it, he also said so. Well, we didn't hear from each other for many years. In 1975, my Fifth Symphony was premiered, and out of the blue, about, I would say, 10 to 15 days later, I got a call from Gunther. "Sam, I just heard your Fifth Symphony. I think it's fantastic. I mean, you just blew me away because you never wrote like this." Well, it was a 12-tone piece, and of course, Gunther was into that. Before then, I was a sort of tonal composer, and he wasn't into that. But he certainly wasn't. And from that time on, we really became bosom friends. And, you know, sometimes a friendship starts in peculiar manners. And that is the way and after that, we talked to each other very often. And, you know, he went to school in Germany, high school in Germany, and I was born in Germany, and he loved to speak German. So whenever he called, and that was quite often, we spoke German, and he loved that. Every time we spoke, he would end the conversation by saying, "Oh, he's so happy to talk to me because he could at least talk a real language." So that was the beginning of the relationship.
That's an interesting story. My next question was going to be, can you describe your relationship with Gunther, which you have to a certain extent, but how did it evolve over time?
Well, you know that Gunther was very interested in education, and so was I. And two things happened. One, we were on a board together of an organization called Performances Abroad, which was taking high school choruses, orchestras, bands overseas. And we were on the board together. And I want to tell you an aside on the board, and that is we always had one board meeting at some really luxurious place. And this was a wonderful hotel on the Yucatan Peninsula. And both Gunther and I were there. Marjorie was there. My wife was there. And Gunther never showed up for anything. I mean, we had dinners and so. Gunther was never there. What was he doing? He was arranging for a publication of Mozart's setting of the G minor symphony for string sextet. He was always busy and wasn't necessarily with his own composition. He was, here was a man who was interested in everything. Whatever had to do with music, he was interested, and he did things with it. And of course, did so much for publishing of works that nobody ever knew, and recording them. And I mean, he spent so much of his own money doing all of these things. And the other thing that came out of this relationship with the music festivals abroad was that we decided that the most important thing would be to feature our youth orchestras. He was interested in the youth orchestras here in Boston, and I was interested in youth orchestras all over the country. We wrote for them. He was commissioned to write pieces. I was commissioned to write pieces. And we got together and said, look, let's have a youth orchestra festival every year. And we would have the youth orchestras present themselves under their conductors, and then we would each give them a master class. And we did that, I would say, for 3 or 4 years before the financial situation dried up, and we just couldn't do it anymore. But it was a wonderful experience. I remember a terrific one that we had in Toronto, Canada, where both of us went up there and 7 youth orchestras came. And we spent 4 days solidly doing master classes, conducting these youth orchestras. And that was always wonderful. And then when I went on leave at Eastman, I asked Gunther to take my place. And he came up to, it was for 2 semesters. He taught at Eastman to take my place while I was in Vienna. Mm-hmm. So.
Yes, George had mentioned that.
Yes.
That his father was at Eastman, and he wasn't sure whether that connection.
Yes, I was, because I asked him to take my place. Mm-hmm. He was very successful. He did not befriend all of the students because he was very frank with them, which I was very happy about. But everybody was just thrilled to have worked with Gunther. And of course, he taught at Tanglewood every summer, and that brought about relationships with a lot of other student composers.
I'm also interested, this is an aside, but in your mutual philosophies regarding music education and what is important.
Well, we both felt, not like everybody always feels, and that is that the craft of musical composition is terribly important. He had great craft, and he forged that relationship with the craft through his playing in orchestras. He always told the story about going from the Metropolitan Opera to his house. I think he lived in Brooklyn at that time, and it was an hour commute, and he would always have 10, 15 scores with him, and he would study the scores going to the Met and going from the Met. And then, of course, he learned so much playing in the orchestra. And I was a string player, and I played in the orchestra. I grew up in Worcester, and I played in the Worcester Philharmonic since I was 12 years old. And this was another common experience between the two of us. And the other and later development between us was the friendship with Milton Babbitt. Milton Babbitt became my closest friend when I was teaching at Juilliard, and we had dinner together every Monday night. This was a real, educational experience for me, because here was a man who knew everybody that was alive in those days, and even that was dead in those days, because he was already in advanced age. And Gunther called him almost every week, and if the week he didn't call Milton, he called me. But he never called me because he only had Emily, my wife's, cell phone number. So he always called her to tell me to call him. So, and when you had a call with Gunther, it was always at least 20 to 25 minutes. You could never just have a short conversation. It was always the world of music in 20 minutes. So that was the later development of our friendship.
What was in your mind? What was unique or special about Gunther?
Oh, I mean, there were so many special things, especially, I would say, the relationship to the many musics. I mean, he was into jazz, there was no difference for him between classical music and jazz. Although, I have to say, he was really wedded to the idea of knowing the great masterpieces. He would always complain about the kids not having enough experience with the repertoire, and he would not excuse that. I mean, he felt one has to have a real basic knowledge of the great masterpieces, and he had that. And he criticized many conductors, as you know, in that famous or infamous book about conducting, which lost him many friends because he really let everybody have it. Nobody could do the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven or the First Brahms like him, and he showed it by recording the two. He spent incredible amounts of money doing these things because he was terribly concerned that people did not follow what the composer wanted on the page. And this was a very interesting thing. That made him unique in the music world, you see. And that was one thing. The other thing was he was so concerned, and as we both were, about the education, not only of the composer, but the musician as a whole. And Gunther, especially in later years, became very interested in the other arts, as he always was. I mean, in his autobiography, he talks about movies, he talks about plays, he talks about books, and so on and so forth. And so he is an example of someone who never went to college and educated himself, very much like our, perhaps, how should we say it, model of an American composer, Aaron Copland, who never went to college, but educated himself in the most diligent way, you see. And Gunther was very much like Copland in that way. Of course, he took Copland's place at Tanglewood and assured that the same kind of education would be preserved at Tanglewood. I'm not sure that's being done today, but I'm not in the loop anymore as far as Tanglewood is concerned.
In my conversations with Gunther, he often, mostly regarding his tenure at the conservatory here and his involvement and transformation of the conservatory, one of the things that he kept bringing up was the importance of the humanities and the study of the humanities.
Exactly.
And how he encouraged his students to go down the street and visit the MFA and
well, he would be thrilled, I think, to see that the conservatory now has a relationship with Harvard, because he was very much concerned, as I still am, about the general education of especially a composer. I cannot see a composer who doesn't read, who doesn't know anything about the humanities, who doesn't know anything about art or literature or the theater or anything like that. I mean, that is something a composer should feel he has to have or she has to have. And both Gunther and I talked about that at great length for many, many years.
And you spoke about his being involved in different types of music, aside from the masterpieces, the classic masterpieces.
Of course. Well, he was very interested in jazz and promoted that, and of course was the founder of the third stream, which is the combination. And the conservatory still has that kind of commitment. Jazz at Eastman, for instance, he liked very much because the person who did jazz was a composer of all kinds of music, film, and was the music director at Radio City Music Hall before he went to Eastman. And the Eastman jazz department was founded upon the idea that everybody had to be an excellent performer, and Gunther always emphasized that. And was very happy that Eastman didn't just start another jazz department, but made as one of the real criteria of going into that department to be an excellent performer.
I'm also interested in the fact that the two of you were contemporary colleagues, composers, and his idea about third string music. Did he discuss that with you a lot?
No, we also had in common the Germanic, and he knew that my acquaintance with jazz or my interest in jazz was sort of minimal, and so we really never discussed that. Maybe perfunctorily sometime, but that was not our main discussion, since we were so wedded to the idea of growing up with the mainstream of music, And that was the only thing we did not have in common, the love and interest and actual performance skills in jazz. Mm-hmm. Because the French horn was not necessarily a jazz instrument until Gunther made it that, you see. So all these things were innovations that he began. And I think of all the composers of the past, let's say, 50 years, Gunther was the most innovative as far as the whole educational process is concerned, and his interests in the various facets of music.
Were you involved with Gunther at Brandeis as well?
No.
I thought George had mentioned.
Well, the thing with Brandeis and myself was a very strange one. I was in the Army. I founded the 7th Army Symphony Orchestra and everything at the end. And when I came back, my mentor at Harvard, when I was a student there, was Irving Fine. And another really great composer, and I'm sorry to say, not known anymore by the young composers of today. And they should, because he was a great composer. And Gunther and he had a good relationship. And Irving had asked me when I was still overseas to come to Brandeis and be the conductor there, because Bernstein, who was the conductor at Brandeis, was going to New York. And so he wanted me to take over all of Bernstein's duties. Well, there were other circumstances, and my parents interfered, and therefore I did not go to Brandeis and went to Dallas instead. And actually, even though I was very angry that this didn't work out, it worked out much better than if I had gone to Brandeis. No, there was no relationship between Gunther and me at Brandeis. There was a relationship with Tanglewood, because in '83, he asked me to come as guest composer to Tanglewood. And I was there with Mario Davidovsky. We were the two guest composers. And there had, of course, much to do with the young composers there, which we taught them every week, a couple of times. And it showed how excellent Gunther's presiding over things were at Tanglewood, especially the New Music Festival, which was really outstanding.
Gunther was, as you know, he was a writer. He functioned on so many different capacities. And I'm just wondering what you feel is his greatest contribution.
Oh, I really think it was his music. He wrote such great pieces which unfortunately, except for the clay piece, are not played anymore. But certain things are played, like the brass music and the brass quintet, for instance, and we shared an interest in writing for these organizations. Also, you know, it as far as writing is concerned, he wrote not only his memoir, but he also wrote that very good book of essays that is very important. And I always have made my students read those essays because I think they're important. And we did have that in common. He was just thrilled with my orchestration book, and I always thank him for that enthusiasm, and also, I wrote a book on choral conducting and one on sight singing and ear training, and he was very supportive of those things. He said, you having taught so much, you should write real textbooks, and I did that.
Yeah, I just recently read a review of your 4th edition of your orchestration book, and I'm going to go out and buy it.
Well, the thing is this, that you never know what's going to make it. Well, the orchestration book has really made it, since I understand from the publisher, more than 80% of American universities and all the universities in China, for instance, use the Chinese edition, and it's now translated into eight languages, and I'm very happy with it.
Yes, it seems like it has replaced the old orchestration books. And
that's
I applaud
that
you.
Makes me very happy about it.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on Gunther's overall impact on society or on the world of music education?
Well, I think the idea of jazz being part of a conservatory is partially due to his enthusiasm of it. I don't think none of us can claim, proprietorship of anything. But I think he had a big influence on especially New England Conservatory. I'm not sure what it is now. Since I'm not actively in the field, I lose contact. But certainly when he was here, he made of it one of the premier institutions of its kind. And there's no doubt about his influence in his writings and especially in his personal. Whoever, you never meet a person that wasn't really influenced by meeting Gunther personally. We all die sometime, and at my age, you never know how, every day is a gift. And this was true of Gunther. He worked to the last minute. He was not very well. Emily and I were very friendly with him, and we saw him at the American Academy just maybe 2 years before he passed away. And he was in pain, and it was a pretty bad situation. But he never gave up, never for one day, and he worked until the end. And I admire that greatly. As far as influence is concerned, we really can't ever measure that until something very special happens. And I think one should just leave it. My father always taught one should leave the world a better place than one found it when one was born. And I think certainly Gunther accomplished that fact.
That's a wonderful statement. Well, we just began this year celebrating the 150th anniversary of the conservatory, and one of the first concerts of a series of concerts that will take place over this year. There were so many comments made about Gunther's influence on the conservatory and the organization as a whole, and how it wouldn't be the organization that it is today
Well, there are two things I'd like to say about that. One was that, Robert Freeman took over the conservatory for just a little while, but Robert Freeman grew up here in Boston, and his father was principal double bass in the BSO. And they were both very close friends with Gunther. And Robert Freeman tried very hard to carry on Gunther's stewardship of the New England Conservatory. Unfortunately, things happened that sort of torpedoed that. However, he tried very hard to do it.
I read somewhere that you also ran a composer's program in Berlin.
Yes. Yes, for the last 12 years. Emily taught conducting to the composers, and we took 14 American composers to Berlin every summer. And they had intensive 2 lessons a week, and we had a concert of their music at the end of the session. We had a 6-week session, and it was a wonderful program. I just gave it up.
Was Gunther ever involved in that?
No, but he was very supportive. He sent many people from whoever he met. He said, "You ought to go to Berlin and study with Sam." So
that's great. Well, I'm coming to the end of my questions. You've given me lots of
great,
wonderful stories. If you have any other anecdotes or stories?
No, I can't think of anything. I'm happy to do this because I think I really value my friendship with Gunther, and when you get to be my age, so many of your friends die, and that leaves tremendous void. And the passing of Milton Babbitt and Gunther Schuller have left tremendous hole in my relationship with people, because we were so close and spoke to each other so often, Whether we needed to or not, there was always some reason to call,
He was just such a warm
personality.
personality.
Oh, yes. And as I said, the calls were never just for a couple of minutes or to say one thing. It was always, it got to be a discussion of important musical subjects, and sometimes not such musical subjects. I mean, we were both interested in political things and so on, and often spoke about the world situation and so on. And we were both interested in these things because he, as mentioned in his book in a very nice manner, he felt the first inclinations of what the Hitler era was doing in Germany, because he was going to school and saw this starting to happen. And of course, I was in Germany. I grew up there until I was 10 years old. So we came to America in 1939, which was quite late. And we had this experience. He didn't have it the same way I did, but he empathized with it.
Mm. I'm sure your experiences were very different.
Of course.
Gunther was sent there as a young boy to go to school, boarding school, right? So he wasn't with his family.
No. No, I mean, and he wasn't Jewish, so it was okay.
Yeah. Very different.
Yeah.
Very different.
But he saw some of the early machinations, you see, of what was going on in his school even. And I think he left of his own volition without his father necessarily wanting him to come back, but because he felt bad of what was going on. He sort of writes that in his autobiography.
Yeah, he also had an accident.
Yes, I know that,
Yeah.
Which,
yeah.
That's, he never was able to drive and so on. This was. And he had that in common with Milton Babbitt, because Milton Babbitt also had a problem with his eyes and was never able to drive. So Marjorie drove for him, and Milton's wife drove all the way for him. So
And that always surprised me to see Gunther, bent over his scores and working, and
well, you
never
really
seemed to
only
stop.
need one eye, one good eye. I have I have only one good eye, so I know what it's like.
Oh, we have something in common. We
Yes.
have one good
Well,
eye.
I had 25 years ago. I had glaucoma in my left eye, so ever since then. But I have peripheral vision in it, and so I can drive, so it's fine.
Well, that's good. How do you think Gunther should be remembered? How?
Well, of course, I always think the composer should be remembered by his works, and I think it was the 10th anniversary of Margon. I wrote a piece dedicated to him. It was an arrangement of a piece for 8 cellos, a Bach prelude, chorale, and fugue. And he actually published that, and now Sherman published it. I don't know if Sherman's doing too good a job on Margon. These days, when you really need publicity and so on, they're not spending enough money on getting these things out to the public. I mean, if I didn't do it myself, nobody would know about it.
Do you have a favorite piece of Gunther's?
Well, of course, I like the piece that I conducted so many years ago, the double quintet, which is, I think, a wonderful, wonderful piece. And I like many of his orchestral pieces. I think the symphony ought to be played more often because I think it's an excellent piece. Spectra is a very good piece, and there are many pieces that I know from the old days. And unfortunately, we have so many conductors that have too many orchestras at the same time that they don't have time to learn new pieces. I mean, I have the same problem with my own pieces. If they weren't recorded, nobody would know them. I'm happy to say, and I'm very anxious to get as many pieces recorded as possible because it's the only way people are going to know them. They're not programmed because, I mean, the big orchestras like BSO or something, well, if you live in the town, for instance, the Toledo Symphony does pieces of mine, and Cleveland and so on, because we're in the neighborhood, and Gunther had a lot of performances by the BSO, which is the way it should be. But beyond that, people are, the conductors are too busy, going around the world making money.
I'm curious, a composer of your caliber and of Gunther's caliber, did you ever share tips about how to get commissions?
Well, I don't think we ever had problems with that. You see, I mean, the last time I spoke to Gunther, he had 23 commissions. And he always, I never talked to Gunther, excuse me, without him saying, I have 25 commissions and I've got to do it tomorrow. This one is due. And he always did it, I don't know how. I always took one at a time. He says, I don't know how you can do that one. I mean, I always work on one and then I work on the other one. I said, I can't do that. I do one at a time. And, at a certain stage, both Gunther and I reach that stage when you have enough commissions to keep you busy. So that was never a problem. We always joked about the many commissions he had at the same time, but I have to say he was very supportive of my work as I was of his. So we never felt there was competition. And I don't think any of us in those days felt that. We were pretty supportive. That is not necessarily true of what's going on today. This is a very different situation anyway. First of all, there are more composers. We have to admit that. There are, And Hindemith wrote a book about the Norton lectures that he gave. In it, he says you walk down Broadway and every other person is a composer. Well, you almost feel that way, today. There's so many, and some of them band together and support each other, but there's a lot of competition and a lot of how should we say, backbiting. That was also true when we were younger, but you grow out of it, I think.
It's always interesting to me being teacher of middle school and high school kids, and when I ask them to name composers, they name
Beethoven,
Mozart.
Brahms, Mozart.
Yes, and when you talk to them about the fact that there are living composers that are writing music today, they're almost shocked or surprised.
Well, then I have to tell you a story. My youngest daughter loves to sing. And when she was a little girl, she sang in every organization possible. And when I think she was in 3rd grade or 4th grade, they had a chorus and they sang a holiday program. And they sang a piece by Mendelssohn, a piece by Beethoven, piece by Mozart, a piece by Gruber, of course, Silent Night, and a piece by me, because they wanted a Hanukkah piece. So she came home very disturbed and said, "Daddy, we're singing a piece by Mendelssohn, piece by Beethoven, piece by Mozart, piece by Gruber, and a piece by you. All the other composers are dead, shouldn't you be?" So there you are. Because we only talk about dead composers, So.
Well, I don't think I have any more questions, but if you have more stories, I would love to listen to.
I have to go back to the hotel to read proofs. I also have written a memoir, which will be out in May. And it has all these stories in it.
Wonderful. Well, listen, I really appreciate all your stories.
My pleasure.
You've been a charming interviewee.
Well, I hope it's enough material for you.